Hello, we are back for another substandard non-HD edition of Quotes the Week. In fact, it's more indie or no definition than high definition. I hope you've had a good week. If you did, that puts you in the minority with much of the human race this week. It's been a pretty rough week. Before we get into quotes and pictures of the week officially, I want to push your eyes and your little computer mouse fingers to something else. A lot of the things that I show you on Quotes of the Week come from a particular site called Vox. And if you're not familiar with Vox, it is great. I would highly encourage you to go and check it out. We are commemorating the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and Vox has some great coverage of this. This is a storm that killed at least 1,200 people, although we don't know the exact number of deaths even 10 years after, and caused about $108 billion in damage. President Obama traveled to New Orleans just yesterday. President George W. Bush was speaking at a high school in New Orleans today. There's some of the events going on to mark the 10th anniversary. If you go on to Vox, you see a whole host of stories that would be worth your while. 7 facts about Hurricane Katrina that shows how incompetent the government's response was. People are still living inside the FEMA toxic Katrina trailers 10 years later, and it shows what adapting to climate change could look like. Anyway, a lot of stories on there. You can go to other sites as well. New York Times has some great coverage, along with the websites for some New Orleans-based newspapers and other major media outlets as well. So I would encourage you to check that out. Okay, so let's get into Quotes of the Week. And the first story we're going to get into here both saddened and angered me, and I imagine many of you felt the same way. Of course, we're going to start with what happened in Virginia early in the week when, in the middle of the morning news for a local TV station there, the young people that you now see on your screen, Allison Parker and Adam Ward, just doing their job, interviewing somebody live on local news, and a gunman drove by and shot and killed both of them. As the hours unfolded, we found out that the gunman was a former employee of that same TV station, felt that he had been improperly fired, and accused Allison Parker and Adam Ward of saying racist things about him in the past. The gunman fled police and ended up taking his own life. Many of us are actually trying to have a civilization here. And one of the hallmarks of a civilized society is that if you're not working in law enforcement, or if you're not involved in one of the branches of the military, you should have an assurance each and every day that if you go to work, and certainly if you're a student, if you go to school, that you don't run the risk of being shot. But sadly, things like what happened earlier in the week in Virginia are happening far too often. If you look at this graphic as it scrolls into view, homicides by firearm per 1 million people. Most of the countries around the world are well under double digits. And yet, you get to our country, 29.7 people out of every million killed by firearm. This chart, also by Vox, the site that I showed you earlier, kind of puts things into view. The United States only represents a little over 4.4% of the global population, and yet, if you look at the other side of that particular graphic, we have 42% of the civilian-owned guns worldwide, which to me seems like more civilian gun ownership than is necessary. This was supposed to have stopped. Never supposed to have started in the first place, but was supposed to have stopped after what happened in December 2012 when another mentally unstable young man went into Sandy Hook Elementary in Massachusetts and killed a bunch of first graders and some teachers. And yet, since then, December 2012, there have been at least 885 mass shootings in our country. Now, Definition of mass shooting kind of varies from different interpretations. For this particular graphic, it involves any incident in which at least 4 people were shot or shot in the direction of. So that's happened at least 885 times since Sandy Hook of December 2012. Look at just this year. Number of mass shootings by day of the year, the calendar year 2015. There have been many, many days where there have been at least one mass shooting, and some there have been more than 3 mass shootings somewhere in our country, and that's just from January through the end of July this year. Something has to be done, and we're involved once again, much like we were after Sandy Hook or after the incident at the movie theater outside of Denver, Colorado, where we are involved in a fake gun control debate. Politicians, activists saying something has to be done, but if the pattern repeats itself, as we've seen time and time again, as we get a little bit further removed from what happened this week in Virginia, as more time goes by, you will hear less and less talk about any sort of meaningful gun control in this country. And it's something that really does need to be addressed. One thing we are talking about instead is a new kind of weapon. And this story, you could call it either scarily funny or terrifyingly humorous. But the quote here, business is skyrocketing higher than ever due to the discussion on prohibition. It is now possible. 2 companies are making commercially available for the first time in our country flamethrowers. And the company who the CEO of which is talking here in that quote, Chris Byers of Ion Productions, a company based in Troy, Michigan. His company has sold 350 flamethrowers at $900 a piece just in the last few weeks, as it seems that there are now some city officials in various cities across the country that are now proposing that, hey, maybe it's not appropriate for regular people to be buying flamethrowers. What is the possible reason of owning a flamethrower? But for the time being, you can get your hand on one of these things, which is, again, I mean, really? Do we need flamethrowers? I don't think so. You may or may not know who the man in that photograph is. He had a showdown with one of the Republican presidential hopefuls this week. The man in the photograph, here's another view of him. His name is Jorge Ramos, and here he is on the cover of Time magazine, named as one of the 100 most influential people. He is the most respected Latino journalist without question. He works for Univision. He is a U.S. citizen now. He also works with the kind of English language joint venture by Univision and ABC News called Fusion. And he has decided to personally take Donald Trump to task for Trump's statements on immigrants from Mexico and Trump's plans for immigration reform, in which he says that he will build a wall stretching 1,900 miles along the entire border between our country and Mexico, and that he would deport 11 million immigrants and make it so that children born to immigrants would not be considered citizens of the United States, even though the Constitution says that they would be. So anyway, Ramos traveled to Dubuque, Iowa this week, was taking part in a press conference with Donald Trump. Both men, you could say, were in the wrong here. Ramos chose to stand up and start firing questions at Trump whenever he had not been called. There's a certain protocol in press conferences, much like in the classroom. Raise your hand, wait for the candidate to call on you, then stand up, ask your question. Ramos chose to just stand up, start asking his questions. Trump did not care for that at all. And as you watch this video, you'll see what happened. Now, Ramos was allowed to come back in after he was escorted out by security. He came back in about 10 minutes later, was then called on to ask his question, and you'll see Trump's rather unique response.
Okay, who's next? Yeah, please. Excuse me, sit down. You weren't called. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Go ahead. No, you don't. You haven't been called.
I have the right to ask the question, and this is the question. You cannot deport 11 million. You cannot deport 11 million people. You cannot build a 1,900-mile wall. You cannot deny citizenship to children in this country. And with those ideas, I'm a reporter, and don't touch me, sir. Don't touch me, sir. You cannot touch me. I have the right to ask a question.
Yes, in order.
I have the right to ask a question. I have the right to ask a question.
No, I wouldn't do that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know really much about him. I don't believe I've ever met him, except he started screaming, and I didn't escort him out. You'll have to talk to security, whoever security has escorted him out. But certainly he was not chosen. I chose you. I chose other people to answer me where you're asking me questions. He just stands up and starts screaming. So, you know, maybe he's at fault also. But I don't consider that. I mean, somebody walked him out. I don't even know where he is. I don't mind if he comes back, frankly. I don't let him forget. And maybe we should have more of that in this country. And maybe the country wouldn't be pushed around so much. Go ahead.
I want to ask you about the Latino vote. You say that you're going to win the Latino vote.
I think so, because I'm going to bring jobs back.
But the truth is, I've seen the polls, the Univision polls say 75% of Latinos.
How much am I suing Univision for right now? No. Do you know the number? No. Tell me. Tell me. Do you know the number? You know you're a part of the lawsuit. How much am I suing Univision for?
But the question is, Mr. Trump.
Wait.
I'm a reporter, Mr.
It's 500 million.
I'm a reporter.
Okay,
and the question
and they're very concerned about it, I have to tell you.
So you allow me to
I'm very good at this stuff.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
You're losing the Latino, 75% of Latinos.
I don't think I will.
No, nationwide.
I haven't even started.
75% of Latinos have a negative opinion of you. Gallup.
Do you know how many Latinos?
The most popular candidate among them all. So, and just check social media.
Do you know how many Latinos work for me? Do you know how many Hispanics are working for me?
Mr. Trump.
Okay.
You know that.
They love me.
That
They love me.
Do
you know how many Hispanics work for me? Thousands. No, do you know how many have worked for me over the years? Tens of thousands.
75% have a negative opinion.
Here's what happens.
You won't win the White House.
Once I win, you're going to see things happen. You know what they want? They want jobs.
And reportedly tonight, Trump said.
So Trump may say that Hispanics love him, Latinos love him, but the statistics do not bear that out at all. Now, according to Gallup polling, this is all of the many Republican presidential contenders. Trump has by far the lowest approval rating of any of them, negative 51%. Jeb Bush there polling the highest at a 11 positive percent rating amongst Latino voters. And why does this matter? There's an estimated 16 million Latino voters are going to take part in the 2016 election. So if you are not able to get that vote, you're probably not going to be elected as president. You compare that to the Hispanic view of Democratic presidential contenders, Hillary Clinton coming in the highest. No place on that chart right now for Vice President Joe Biden. He's rumored to perhaps be getting into the race. However, he says that he's still a couple weeks out from making any final decisions on that one way or another. Speaking of immigration, something that we've talked about over and over again in Quotes of the Week, the ongoing rush of migrants, people seeking asylum status, refugees coming into Europe, fleeing war-torn regions in Syria and across the Middle East. Well, European officials were calling an emergency meeting in Vienna, Austria over the last couple of days. And while they were taking part in that meeting, a horrific discovery was made. Authorities found the bodies of about 71 suspected refugees decomposing in the back of that truck pulled off along a highway not far from the border between Austria and Hungary. It's believed that the migrants suffocated in the back of the trunk of that particular vehicle. They were being trafficked, got locked in there. Just today, 4 men have been arrested in conjunction with that. And the same day that that discovery was made, and that was just yesterday, 2 boats carrying hopeful migrants capsized off the coast of Libya in North Africa. Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, has said that any refugees who make it to Germany would be granted asylum status. There needs to be some sort of safe haven for them. Many of them don't make it. Those that do, though, have been met with young Germans marching through the streets, howling at them, and young Germans with their hands up in the air, chanting Hitler-esque slogans is something that the rest of us need to be concerned about. If you look at where they're coming from, right, there are a few different routes. Hungary, in an attempt to stop this, says they're going to build a border fence, taking the Donald Trump approach to solving a immigration issue. And in 2015, we've really seen an increase of this. If you look at the Western Balkan route, for all of 2014, there were 43,360 illegal border crossings. Through the end of July this year, that's already gone up to more than 102,000. In the Eastern Mediterranean route, 50,830 for all of 2014 so far. This year, more than 132,000. And I mentioned this issue of hostility presented towards these people that are trying to get refugee status. Neo-Nazis gathered to protest this at a newly established shelter in the East German town of Heidenau. Germany alone is going to get as many as 800,000 asylum seekers this year, which is the biggest influx they've had since the end of World War II. This then ended up with clashes with police. 30 police officers were injured over this past weekend. Other demonstrators came to protest against the protesters. They got in a fight against the original protest group. Chancellor Merkel didn't say anything about this for several days, then finally in midweek issued a statement saying it's repulsive how far-right extremists and neo-Nazis are trying to herald dumb messages of hate. At the same time, it is shameful how citizens, even families with kids, are supporting these things by tagging along. Germany is a country which represents the dignity of every single individual. That is what it says in our Constitution. This applies to everyone staying in our country. So we will have to see what happens here. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped more than 1,000 points to start trading on Monday, affecting the retirement accounts of millions of people in our country. Why did this happen? It has a lot to do with what's been going on in the Chinese economy. This graphic from Time magazine kind of explains how China is affecting investors here in the United States. Dow had been having a really good year. Many American companies were growing by starting to sell products in China, which means any Chinese economic slowdowns are going to affect the economy here. And China has been slowing down. As a result of that, local investors in China started selling stocks. When word of that reached the United States, caused U.S. investors to start selling stocks as well. This is a reminder of just how connected the global economy is. The good news here, though, is that as the week has progressed, things seem to have stabilized a little bit. We'll keep our eyes on this, certainly. And sticking with news in China, and there is a money connection to this. A woman tried to get on board a plane at Beijing Capital International Airport earlier this week, and she had with her a $200 bottle of cognac, a bottle of liquor, and she thought she'd be able to walk this right onto the plane. She was stopped by officials at the airport who told her that that was not acceptable in carry-on luggage that exceeded their liquid requirement. She realized that she was going to be forced to have to leave that $200 bottle of cognac at the gate and not take it with her. So she said, "That's not going to happen to me." She proceeded to down the entire bottle. Unsurprisingly, she then fell to the floor and was declared too drunk to be able to fly. She was put into a wheelchair by airport security, wheeled into an office, stayed there until she sobered up, and was picked up by her relatives at 7 o'clock later that night. But she showed them, and that's all that matters. They did not get her bottle of cognac. We have no way of knowing where she was eventually headed. She seems, though, to be somebody who's into taking things to the extreme. So perhaps she was bound for the village of Buñol, not far from Valencia in Spain. And you've probably never heard of this village, but perhaps you've heard of what they celebrate there each and every year, as they have done for the last 70 years, a rather unique festival called La Tomatina. And this was the 70th running of La Tomatina. Now, the origins of this festival are murky at best. It dates back to the tail end of World War II. There's lots of different theories as to how it started, where people would gather and pelt each other with tomatoes. One of the origin stories actually has to do with former Spanish dictator Francisco Franco, who was in charge of Spain at the end of the Second World War. And his country was not involved in World War II. But the theory goes something like this, that there were young people in the village who saw some Catholic priests coming through their town, and these young people viewed the priests as symbols of authority and symbols of Franco's conservative Catholicism, and they took it upon themselves to throw tomatoes at these priests. And allegedly, since then, this has grown into a larger festival. So large, in fact, that most of the people that come are tourists. They started selling tickets to go in and take part in this and have this done to you. And they don't even grow tomatoes near La Buñol. They have to get them from somewhere else. So they bust these tomatoes in. Anyway, I'm going to show you what this week's 70th edition of the Tomatina Festival looked like. Hope you enjoyed that. That's it for this week's Quotes of the Week. We hope to be back next week. Until then, be good to each other.